Hi, this is HIS 121 Test 2 Review Part 2. This will cover chapters 9 through 11. So only a couple questions from chapter 9. The first, number 21, identify the following. The Cumberland Road, and I had in parentheticals there, Wilderness Road, really probably just should be Cumberland Road, was part of the national road that was built to basically make travel easier in the first half of the 19th century from the east to the west. This road ran from Cumberland, Maryland, all the way to Illinois. Wilderness Road was just a small portion of Cumberland Road, really, that went south. That's why I need to remove that. The Cumberland Road itself was part of something called the National Road that continued to be expanded. But the significant thing about the Cumberland Road was that there was actually federal money spent to try to improve the ability of folks to be able to go westward during that time period. Today, if you were on Interstate 68 out of Cumberland, Maryland, and then later on, a little bit further west, if you're on Interstate 70, that would sort of mirror the path that the Cumberland Road took. Erie Canal was important because it was a canal that was built in New York that allowed boats to go across the state of New York and go to the Great Lakes. So individuals were able to move goods much more quickly through a series of rivers that were connected by this canal system. Is now part of the New York Canal system, and it's really used more for recreational use today, as large ships tend to go down the St. Lawrence Riverway, go through the Wellman Canal in Ontario, then to the Great Lakes that way. But this was the first way to connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, was through the Erie Canal. Robert Fulton is significant because he developed the steam engine in the early 1800s. He built the steamboat, the Clermont. That was an important advance in water transportation because it allowed individuals to ship goods much more quickly. It was a very difficult process to move boats upstream prior to the development of the steam engine, so that made water transportation much more efficient, much quicker. The downside to steam transportation, steamboats, as they were used throughout much of the 1800s, the downside is it could be very dangerous. There was a lot of pressure built up in the steam engines, and it was not uncommon for there to be explosions, and that caused some significant water disasters in the 1800s. Eli Whitney is a very important figure. He was from the Northeast, came down to tutor on some southern plantations, and as he watched slaves pick cotton and saw how important cotton was, he came up with this machine, the cotton engine, or better known as a cotton gin, that would remove seeds from cotton in a much more efficient process than to do so by hand. That cotton gin continued to be improved upon, and so that the production of cotton increased dramatically in the South. And by the time we get to the 1860s, just before the start of the Civil War, cotton is by far the leading export from America. In fact, almost accounts for half of American exports at that time. The downside to Eli Whitney's development of the cotton gin was that it really increased the demand for slavery, especially in the Deep South, where cotton was more frequently grown. Cyrus McCormick was a Virginian, actually born up in the Shenandoah Valley, who moved to the Midwest, and he developed the McCormick Reaper, which allowed farmers to harvest a lot more crops than they did without using a mechanized reaper. That's what the McCormick Reaper was. It was a mechanized reaper, so it really increased productivity about 6 times faster as far as harvesting, and had a big impact on Midwestern farms. Number 22 doesn't show up necessarily in Chapter 9. It does show up in your slides for Chapter 9. But it was a significant development and something that I think your book should have addressed, whether in that chapter or a later chapter. But the question is, what two places did massive number of immigrants come to America from in the 1840s and 1850s? The answer is the two countries, Ireland and Germany. Ireland occurred primarily because of a tragic situation that occurred in Ireland with the Great Potato Famine. Hundreds of thousands of Irish people starved to death. Millions actually left Ireland to come to America and Canada, and that occurred primarily in the 1840s. The other location for this massive number of immigration was from Germany, and I use the term Germany even though Germany was not a unified country at the time. It was comprised of several German states. Germany did not unite until 1870. But these Germans, because of political turmoil, there was in 1848 a series of revolutions broke out in Europe, and so a lot of German immigrants came to America. So that time period from 1845 to 1854 was the highest 10-year period in American history as far as the percentage of immigrants coming into the country, and again, primarily from Ireland and Germany. The second half of that question, what religious group grew dramatically in the U.S. because of this immigration, and that would be Catholicism. The overwhelming majority of Irish who came to America during that time period were Catholic. A large number of the Germans, especially if they came from the southern German states, were also Catholic. And so that was the highest period percentage-wise, per capita-wise, of immigration in American history. So on to chapter 10 now with question number 23. What was the corrupt bargain in the presidential election of 1824, and who won the presidential election of 1828? So as I mentioned, after the War of 1812, the Federalist Party sort of disappeared, so that really left the Republicans as the only party. And again, we call them the Democratic Republicans because they are not the same Republican Party that we have today. So out of those Republicans, there were four candidates that emerged. John Quincy Adams, who was the son of the former President of the United States, second President of the United States, John Adams, and John Quincy Adams had also served as the Secretary of State. He was one of the candidates. The other leading candidate was Andrew Jackson, who was the military hero from the Battle of New Orleans that had occurred in 1815, and he had been a congressman from Tennessee. The other two candidates, Henry Clay, who was the Speaker of the House, one of the Republican war hawks we had talked about as we discussed the causes of the War of 1812. And then the fourth candidate was actually born in Nelson County, Virginia, but was a congressman from Georgia, and that was William Crawford. And Crawford, had he not been suffering from illness, may have emerged as the leading candidate, but his health problems kept him as just one of the four. So the U.S. Constitution requires any person who's elected president to win the majority of votes in the Electoral College. So what happened in this election of the four candidates, the two leading vote getters were Andrew Jackson, who got the most popular votes and most electoral votes, and John Quincy Adams, who finished second in both those categories. But Jackson did not get the majority of electoral votes, so that meant that the House of Representatives would determine the election. And Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House, so he had a lot of influence in the House, how they would vote. What happened is John Quincy Adams actually wins the vote in the House of Representatives, and Henry Clay becomes his Secretary of State. And that's what's known as the corrupt bargain. It was not illegal, but supposedly John Quincy Adams had convinced Clay to support him in return for the Secretary of State's position, and in the end the House of Representatives voted for John Quincy Adams. And that really impacted John Quincy Adams' presidency. There was some question whether or not he was the legitimate president or not. And it's kind of unfortunate because John Quincy Adams had really been a great American servant. Even as a child, he traveled with his father overseas during the American Revolution. but his presidency did not go very well. So he was the winner in the 1824 election. By the time the election of 1828 rolled around, everybody was very anxious to vote then for Andrew Jackson, who had complained about what he called this corrupt bargain, and Jackson won the 1820 election very handedly and became President of the United States. Question number 24, what was the spoils system? After Jackson won the election in 1828, he decided to reward those individuals who supported them by dishing out a lot of government jobs to those individuals. Previously, it was believed that presidents should try to fill those jobs with individuals who were experienced and had capabilities to carry out those positions. Jackson believed that loyalty was more important than expertise or experience, and so he filled lots of government jobs, and the big one where you could really bring on a lot of people would be through the Postal Service, and handed out jobs that way, and some people criticized that, but the spoils system would essentially remain in effect until we got into the 1880s, when reform was pushed, and then the assassination of James Garfield, our president at the time, helped bring about those change in law that basically eliminated the spoils system in favor of what we have now in government, which is called a merit-based system, where you have to have certain skills before you can be hired or pass exams and so on. Now, that does not apply to the top positions in the government, like cabinet positions, which are again political appointments, but it does apply right now to many of the everyday bureaucratic government jobs. But that was not the case with Andrew Jackson, who had his spoils system. Number 25 asks about what was the Eaton Affair, also known as the O'Neill or Petticoat Affair. It involved really a social disagreement between the wives of cabinet members in Andrew Jackson's White House, and particularly directed at one wife of another cabinet member. It becomes important because it changes Andrew Jackson's relationship, it strains his relationship with his vice president, John Calhoun. The Petticoat Affair, basically, or the Eaton Affair, dealt with Peggy Eaton, who was the wife of John Eaton, the Secretary of War in the Jackson cabinet. She was well known in Washington, D.C. Her husband had apparently committed suicide overseas because she had carried on inappropriate relationships with other men. There's some question about her relationship with John Eaton as before they got married. But anyway, she was known for being a very beautiful woman around Washington, and the other wives of Jackson's cabinet members did not care for her, and they sort of excluded her, ostracized her, and that affected the relationship of Jackson and his cabinet members. And Jackson ended up taking her side because his wife Rachel had gone through something very similar, because she and Jackson, when they initially got married, it was discovered she was still married to her first husband, Rachel was, and so she was basically in a bigamous relationship until they got things worked out. And Rachel Jackson had died, and Andrew Jackson believed it was her health had been impacted by those who were so critical of her, and so he saw that in Peggy Eaton. And so because John Calhoun, his vice president, his wife had been one of the leaders who was so critical of Peggy Eaton, that created some distance between John Calhoun and Andrew Jackson. And so in 1832, when Jackson runs for president again, he replaces John Calhoun with a bachelor, Martin Van Buren, his Secretary of State, widower, Martin Van Buren, and Van Buren will then be in line to become president in 1836 instead of John Calhoun. Speaking of John Calhoun, question number 26, what happened in the nullification crisis and how did it end? The nullification crisis deals with a tariff that Calhoun had helped propose because he was sure it would be defeated, but instead it passed Congress, and it was a tariff that imposed 45% tax on raw materials imported from other countries, and that especially hit the South hard because, one, it was going to impact how other countries treated cotton, but also because there was very little manufacturing in the South, so southern states had to import goods from other places, and so this tariff really adversely impacted southern states and especially hit Calhoun State, South Carolina. South Carolina was an interesting state. It had a minority white population. There were more slaves than there were whites in South Carolina. Their tensions were high already, and so with this tariff passing that Calhoun had been sure would be defeated and would make people take a position on the tariff, that meant that South Carolina was really impacted adversely. So the South Carolinians held a state convention, basically, where they and South Carolina politicians made the decision that they would not enforce this federal law. They would instead nullify it, going back to the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of Jefferson and Madison. They had used that same language, and so they refused to enforce the tariff. And Calhoun had actually, while he was vice president, or just before he became vice president, has secretly written against the tariff in 1828. And so this led to a divide between the federal government and the state of South Carolina. Andrew Jackson, who didn't love the tariff and had been a proponent of states' rights, would not stand for South Carolina to just deny this federal law. So he's organized troops to send into South Carolina. So it looked like we might actually have a civil war at that point between the federal government and South Carolina over this tariff. But Henry Clay, who became known as the Great Compromiser, intervened and helped resolve the tariff, get it reduced, and the nullification crisis ended, fortunately, before there was any conflict. So it was a compromise by Henry Clay that ended the nullification crisis of 1832. Of course, we know less than 3 decades later, South Carolina would secede from the United States as the first state to become a part of the Confederate States as we had the Civil War. Number 27, what was the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the Trail of Tears? And this was really certainly a black mark on the presidency of Andrew Jackson, because it really was very inhumane determination to remove a significant number of American Indians from the Southeast. What happened is in southern states, as cotton was becoming such a valuable cash crop, the demand for land increased, and there were the five civilized tribes, they were called, because they had adopted a lot of characteristics of white Americans, including even the ownership of slaves in some cases. But the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokees, the Choctaw, the Seminole, the Creek, and the Chickasaw Indians, were caught up in this really a push for them to sign treaties and agree to sell their land. There was a lot of intrigue involved in that, but basically they really didn't have a choice in some cases, and so all of these tribes were pushed to what became known as the Indian Territory, which basically was the state of Oklahoma. So you had Cherokees from North Carolina being forced to move to Oklahoma. Seminoles refused in Florida to abide by this and carried out under Osceola a number of attacks against those soldiers trying to force them west. Some Cherokees in North Carolina hid in the Smoky Mountains and so remained there throughout and never moved. But in the end, though, about 100,000 American Indians were forcibly removed from the southeast all the way to Oklahoma, and it especially hit the Cherokees hard. Several thousand Cherokees died, men, women, and children, as it was a forced migration with soldiers pushing them to Oklahoma. and that forced migration became known as, especially for the Cherokees, as the Trail of Tears. And a lot of the treaties that the American Indian tribes were forced into signing, of course, were violated later on. Number 28, identify the following: the Black Hawk War. That was another Indian conflict, this one in Illinois, involving the Sac and Fox Indians, who were led by Chief Black Hawk. If you're ever wondering why the Chicago National Hockey League team is called the Blackhawks, that was named after Black Hawk. Abraham Lincoln fought in the Black Hawk War, but the Sac and Fox were defeated there. Alexander de Tocqueville was a Frenchman who traveled throughout America in the 1830s and wrote a book on democracy. He was really impressed, democracy in America, really impressed with how, even on the frontier, how Americans knew so much about government and the Constitution and things along those lines. So he was very critical of slavery in that book. We could question how much Americans know about democracy today with the prevalence of conspiracy theories and things like that, and the lack of understanding of the Constitution. But that was really not the case even in a time period where Americans were not very well educated. They still, understanding the government and understanding the Constitution was very important to common people during that time period. Tippecanoe in Tyler 2 just refers to the campaign slogan for William Henry Harrison, who had been the hero at Tippecanoe in the 1810s. He had defeated Indian Alliance, and he was now the Whig candidate for president. The Whigs, that was the political party that emerged as a second political party as the Republican Party split up, the Democratic Republican Party. And so what happens is the Republican supporters of Andrew Jackson then become known as the Democrats, and that is the beginning of the modern Democratic Party. It emerged from many of the Democratic Republicans who followed Jackson. The others formed a party, the National Republicans, as they were called, formed a party called the Whig Party. Again, the modern Republican Party won't be around until the 1850s, but we'll talk about that later. So William Henry Harrison wins the election of 1840 as the first Whig president ever. Unfortunately for him, he gave a very long inaugural address, got sick, died after a month, and was replaced by John Tyler, another Virginian, as the 10th President of the United States. Just so you know, John Tyler became president in 1841. Today, one of his grandchildren still lives here in Virginia in his 90s. Interesting story. We won't go into it now, but just fascinating that a man who was president of the United States in 1841, 183 years later, still has a grandson who is alive. But anyway, number 29, what was the Northwest Passage and what did Lewis and Clark and Corps of Discovery do? That is part of our first discussion in chapter 11. The Northwest Passage was a way to try an effort to improve transportation and the speed of individuals to get to the Pacific Ocean. There was this belief that there was a waterway that could be utilized, that you could transport goods across the United States by water all the way to the Pacific Ocean. That turned out not to be the case. However, despite the lack of this Northwest Passage, the U.S. did now have access to much of the territory in North America thanks to an agreement between Thomas Jefferson and Napoleon. During Jefferson's presidency, the U.S. purchased what was known as the Louisiana Territory from France and Napoleon. And the Louisiana Territory, the purchase of this basically doubled the size of America. It gave America full control of the Mississippi River. It gave us all the territories on the west, well, at that time was the western frontier in the Midwest, and turned out to be a hugely significant acquisition of territory for the U.S., and so that territory had to be explored. So Jefferson sent two individuals he knew from Albemarle County, Virginia, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. William Clark was the brother of George Rogers Clark, who had been a Revolutionary War hero. And they took off with 24 men with them, and Clark's, Meriwether Lewis's rather large dog, a Newfoundland dog, and they traveled all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which was actually beyond the boundaries of the Louisiana Territory. And they explored, mapped this territory, collected samples of animals. They saw bison, which they were amazed by. They saw prairie dogs. They saw all sorts of game. They established relationships with a lot of Indian tribes across the country. They mapped out these passages and so on. They did find out that there was not an all-water route. In fact, they undertook some amazing things to carry boats across to navigate around falls. They basically had to walk boats over land. I mean, incredible physical feats. And in the end, this took over 2 years, this journey, and they only lost one person. They had one individual who died of disease. They had some close encounters with Indians, but they had help from a woman by the name of Sacagawea, who was a Shoshone Indian who helped get horses for them, and she actually traveled with them with her infant child for a while. But it was really a remarkable feat, and we learned a lot about the West, and that was the Lewis and Clark and the core discovery. They explored this Louisiana Territory and the Northwest, and helped facilitate America moving west from St. Louis further west. That occurred, by the way, from 1805 to 1807. What did the U.S. get in the Adams-Onis Treaty? That was a treaty with Spain that basically gave us the rest of Florida. We had all of Florida, and it also gave us part of what would become territory into what would become Texas. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. Number 31, what was the Missouri Compromise? The Missouri Compromise occurred in 1819. What became apparent even 40 years before the Civil War is that there was a great deal of political tension between slave states and states that were free states that did not have slavery. And that tension especially was noticeable in the United States Senate, where each state had 2 senators. And to maintain the balance of power in the U.S. Senate, it was important to have the same number of slave states and free states until we get to a point where that's not possible. But in 1819, Missouri was going to become part of the U.S. as a state. It was clearly going to be a slave state based on the number of slaveholders who were there with slaves. So the question is, what would happen? How would that balance out in the Senate? And so what happens is Maine, which had been a territory and had been settled long before but had never become a state, is admitted to the Union as a free state, and then Missouri is admitted as a slave state. And that was part of that Missouri Compromise of 1819. The other thing, though, is that the compromise set the southern boundary of Missouri as a border where any territory above it would come in as free territory, any territory below it would come in as slave territory. However, when that gets tested in the 1850s, we're going to see that that doesn't hold up, and the Missouri Compromise is essentially forgotten. As we scroll down here, the next question, number 32, what happened at the Alamo? What was the Lone Star Republic? Well, American settlers had increasingly moved west into what was known as Texas, and Texas was part of the nation of Mexico. It was a Mexican state, and so there was an increasing number of Americans moving into Texas. When they did so, they had to agree that they would follow Mexican law. They also had to, and Mexican law prohibited slavery, by the way. They also had to agree to convert to Catholicism, though most did not. But what happens, though, in the 1820s, after Mexico has become an independent country from Spain in 1821, we start to see as we get into the 1830s that there is basically certain states in Mexico revolting against the government. Texas was one of those, and that led to a fight basically between the Mexican soldiers and the Texans, and this included a lot of Tejanos who supported this independence movement. And Tejanos were Mexican residents. They were not coming from America, even though they were outnumbered by the Americans in Texas. They were part of this effort for Texas to become a free state. And so at the Alamo, we hear a lot about the Alamo, and if you go to San Antonio, you can see it. The Alamo was a disastrous event for the Texans. They were routed by the Mexicans, and basically all of the soldiers fighting for Texas were either killed in battle or captured and then executed, essentially. That incident at the Alamo is avenged by a Virginian by the name of Sam Houston. He defeats Santa Anna, the Mexican leader and general, and he is defeated at a place called San Jacinto. In some areas it would be called San Jacinto, but there's San Jacinto. And it was a battle where the Texans win, and so Texas basically wins its independence from Mexico. Initially, some Texans are ready to join the United States. However, the U.S., because of the tension over slavery in the 1830s, they are not quick they are concerned about annexing Texas initially. And so Texas then, for a while, becomes an independent nation with its one star, and that is how it became known as the Lone Star Republic and the Lone Star State. But it's not long, though, before Texas is in fact annexed by the United States and becomes part of the USA. That being said, there's still disputes between the United States and Mexico about where Texas's border should be. The treaty was pretty clear, but as far as it did not go to the Rio Grande, but during the 1840s and 50s, the U.S. Government was strongly pushing towards expansion of America. This is something called Manifest Destiny we'll talk about later. And so Zachary Taylor, another Virginian who was President of the United States, our 12th president, he orders, James K. Polk, who was president, who was from North Carolina, orders a Virginian, Zachary Taylor, military leader, to take American troops all the way to the Rio Grande, knowing that this is going to create a conflict, and it does, and that becomes the Mexican-American War. The Mexican War, it's called. In 1848, the U.S. sends troops all the way into Mexico City even, and eventually wins this war. Zachary Taylor, who will then become President of the United States later on, is the military hero, and the U.S. now has Texas, and it goes all the way to the Rio Grande River. And in addition, with the victory in the Mexican War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo supplies America with what is today almost all of the Southwest United States. The U.S. not only gets Texas all the way to the Rio Grande, but we now get California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado. So where we had been making a claim for Northwest Territory because of the Louisiana Purchase and the exploration of Lewis and Clark, now we have the Southwest as well, though some of the borders are not worked out till later on. But the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo greatly expanded the size of the United States. People who are opposed to slavery were very angry about the war because they felt, and to a degree they're right, an effort to really expand American territory, and for Southerners, the ability to potentially expand slave territory. Number 34, what led to the massive increase in population of California in 1848 and 1849? California, when it was acquired by the U.S. as a result of the Mexican War, was sparsely populated. They had a lot of missions there. So if you think about cities like San Jose, San Francisco, of course, any cities that had San, Spanish term for saint, there were a lot of missions there in California. Not a lot of people. That changes in late 1848 and into 1849 with the discovery of gold. That's the answer to number 34, the discovery of gold. And San Francisco suddenly becomes a large American city almost overnight. I mean, really within a year or two, because of the people traveling to California to search for gold. Number 35, what was the Wilmot Proviso? The Wilmot Proviso was a proposal by a Democratic congressman that any territory acquired by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that slavery would be prohibited there. And the end result of this Wilmot Proviso, it never took effect, but what happens is it essentially splits the Democratic Party between the Northern Democrats and Southern Democrats, or the pro-expansion of slavery Democrats versus those opposed to the expansion of slavery Democrats, and essentially that was by geographic terms. And so it has an impact on what happens politically in the 1850s, the Wilmot Proviso. What was the Free Soil Party? That's the party that's going to be the precursor to the modern Republican Party. The Free Soil Party was the party of those Whigs and Northern Democrats who were opposed to the expansion of slavery. And again, that's going to eventually basically evolve into what becomes the Republican Party. What provisions made up the Compromise of 1850? Well, you remember we talked about the Missouri Compromise, set that boundary, the southern boundary of Missouri, as where slaves below that would be slave territory, above it would be non-slave territory, free soil. Of course, it doesn't really address issues like when you acquire a territory like California that was both above and below that line, but all of a sudden, with all the people moving into California, now California within a couple of years is ready to be admitted to the United States as a state. So how do you do that? Because again, that balance between the slave states and free states in the U.S. Senate. So a series of legislation was passed in 1850 that enabled California to be admitted as a free state. That was one of the big parts of the Compromise of 1850. California comes in as a free state. I know it's kind of messed up on your slides, and I'm sorry about that. But then the other territories in the Southwest come under this doctrine of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty meaning, and we'll talk about that in the next test, what the people could decide whether slavery would exist in those territories. Slave trade was abolished in Washington, D.C. Not slavery, but slave trade. You could no longer sell and buy slaves in Washington, D.C. So all those things seem to support free soilers, or those opposed to the expansion of slavery. So what did the slave states get out of this compromise? Well, the legislation of the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act basically allowed Southerners to go north to claim escaped slaves, and this law forced Northerners, who before may have not had a strong opinion about slavery, it forced them to help those slave hunters trying to find slaves, that they had to provide support, and if they were housing any escaped slaves, then that would get them in trouble. They could go to jail. And Northerners did not like the Fugitive Slave Act at all. In fact, it turned a lot of folks who didn't have a strong opinion about slavery against slavery. The other issue that happens sometimes with the Fugitive Slave Act, it was very tough for free blacks to show that they were free blacks. So not only were escaped slaves captured and returned to the South into slavery, but in some cases people who had never been slaves were taken south and turned into slaves. If you were a free black, even in the North and free states, you had to be very careful, because you might end up in the hands of slave traders or these slave hunters who would take you back to the South as a slave. Okay, that's question number 35. So again, the Compromise of 1850, California coming in as a free state, slave trade abolished in D.C., popular sovereignty in other Southwest territories, and then for those who supported slavery, the big thing was the Fugitive Slave Act that allowed them to recapture escaped slaves and forced people, whites in the North, to support their efforts. Okay, that's the end of test review number 2, and those were chapters 9 through 11.